This is my final section. So this is the research, and basically what we do in the report is we try to look for as much as we can all of the research that's been done in a year and summarize it in the relevant sections. And it's really to try to draw attention to what research is there and help people to make it as usable as possible. So what I'm going to do is mostly a signposting exercise in what research we've highlighted in the report, but also to summarize the findings for some of them. So for legal migration, there was a very interesting, of course, if I do say so myself, I wasn't an author on this report, but it was an ESRI report on wages and working conditions of non-Irish nationals. And that found that non-Irish nationals tend to be in lower quality jobs, things like less trade union memberships. There's a lot of other findings as well. And what I think of the standout findings was this idea of the migrant wage gap. So they found that non-Irish nationals earn 22% less per hour worked, and that is even worse for women. Another really interesting one was the Irish Council for International Students did an accommodation survey of international students, and they've repeated this a couple of times, is my understanding, and basically found really, really big issues for international students to do with accommodation. They found that 55% felt that their mental health had suffered because of difficulties in finding accommodation or poor quality accommodation. Less than half surveyed had a lease agreement, and 10% had been the victim of an accommodation scam. Ivan Pravalko and co-authors also did a piece of research on how migrants fare in the labour market, looking at various characteristics and how they impact labour market participation. And Cliona Murphy and co-authors also looked at migrant fishers' experience of hyper-precarity and hyper-dependency, a really interesting qualitative paper. Moving to international protection, there was, of course, a lot in this area. One of the interesting ones I thought was the Irish Refugee Council's report looking at homelessness among international protection applicants. They talked to applicants, NGOs and service providers and highlighted significant concerns, including in relation to safety and experiences of assault and harassment highlighted by applicants, issues with access to medical care and a lack of identification of vulnerabilities according to those groups, and recommendations including access to full social welfare entitlements, ending the reliance on NGOs and homeless service providers for providing services to those groups, and guidance to local authorities to prevent rough sleeping, a really interesting report with some really interesting findings. Karen Smith and other co-authors then also published a piece on family reunification with young refugees. Again, really interesting qualitative work with service providers and refugees. They found a heavy burden on young sponsors and a lack of supports for that group in applying for family reunification, as well as significant risk of housing precarity and homelessness for families on arrival. Another interesting piece on international protection was by LGBT Ireland, looking at LGBTI plus people living in IPAS accommodation. They found that poor management and the existing complaints procedures cannot guarantee safety, and they highlighted quite a few different recommendations. They looked at the EU kind of practices as well as Irish practices in that. Really interesting reports from the Oireachtas Library and Research Service. So there are 3 separate reports looking at the Irish context, the EU developments and the global context. ESRI and EMN Ireland, led by Emily, who you'll be hearing from shortly, also published a piece on labour market integration of international protection applicants, looking at policy, practice and statistics. And the Irish Refugee Council also published a piece of research on experiences of families and children in direct provision. On temporary protection then, the Migration Policy Institute, which is a migration research institute based in Brussels and Washington, looked at lessons from the Ukraine hosting response for refugee sponsorship programs. So essentially looked at hosting, private hosting arrangements in different countries, including Ireland, and tried to draw lessons from others and identified some recommendations for those hosting responses as well. And Felicity Daly and Jackie O'Riordan also looked at divisions of care, so different responses to Ukrainian refugees and asylum seekers, and the impacts on asylum seekers and the perception of asylum seekers of that, so based on focus groups, which I thought was quite an interesting methodology as well. Looking at vulnerable groups, then the Immigrant Council of Ireland published a policy paper on migrant experiences of domestic abuse in Ireland. They found a lack of legal certainty, in part due to discretionary guidelines and discrepancies between policies and practice, and kind of commended that this was often more favourable, so there was flexibility there from frontline kind of decision makers, but that this could lead to confusion and a lack of awareness of what might actually be possible for migrants. They also found barriers to reporting and accessing state services. Sorry, that should come up first. UNHCR Ireland also published a really interesting report called Mapping Statelessness in Ireland, and they found challenges in relation to a lack of the statelessness determination procedure and a lack of guidance for staff who encounter statelessness, but also found evidence of really positive engagement from those staff. But also identified a need to identify statelessness at the registration stage of international protection because it's very difficult to change it later, and found cases of prolonged legal limbo for stateless people in Ireland. Very quickly then, sorry, I don't know, the animations are a bit off. Two really interesting ESRI reports on integration. So of course we have our 8th monitoring report on integration, and the next one is due out in the next few months. So this looks at outcomes for migrants across a range of indicators. And the other one was an ESRI report that compares migrant integration in Ireland and Northern Ireland. Found highly skilled migrants tend to be more highly skilled in both, but are even more so in Ireland. They looked at experiences of cross-border travel, which was really challenging for a lot of migrants, and also looked at attitudes, found that attitudes were more positive towards migrants in Ireland than Northern Ireland, and that this can be explained by essentially people in Ireland, south of the border, are more optimistic about the future, have more contact with migrants, and are more likely to feel that their voice is heard in politics, which are all really important for attitudes. So just to highlight, Shirley Martin and co-authors looked at refugee and migrant children's experiences of education integration. Frances McGinley and co-authors looked at post-school expectations and outcomes among migrant origin young people. And Mary Gilmartin did a really interesting piece of research on migrants' experiences of local authority integration efforts. Just to quickly highlight then, the IOM, both the UK and Irish IOM and the Department of Justice looked at, did a piece on human trafficking on the island of Ireland, found that it is more prevalent than official data implies. And the Toronto Metropolitan University also looked at regularization programs in Europe, one of which was Ireland, and looked at kind of recommendations and how those were structured. So a lot of really interesting research there. Like I said, this is more of a signposting exercise to let people know that that research exists, and if you're interested in any of those, to go and have a look at it. And I will pass over to Emily to have a look at case law now, and then we'll take questions on both those sections at the end.
Perfect. Thank you, Ciara. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to present some of the key cases from 2023 that we saw in the courts. These are all in the annual report and also up on the EMN Ireland website under legal resources. So if you want any more information on them, please do go look there, and we try to keep them up to date as much as we can. So moving on to some of the key cases that we saw in 2023. The first set, and Ciara already alluded to this, concerned reception conditions. So these were about homeless international protection applicants. Two of the key cases were SY in April, which I'll talk a bit more about in a minute, and then SA and RJ, which resulted in a preliminary reference to the Court of Justice of the European Union. The case number for that is 9724, so that will likely, well, at least an Advocate General's opinion, hopefully by the end of the year on that one. And then we also had a Dublin 3 regulation case. We had a number of these in the court, but this one, RG, looks at the kind of relationship between remedies and timelines. So for those who are familiar with the Dublin 3 regulation, that's Article 27 and its relationship with Article 29, and how they operate where somebody has been issued with a transfer decision but wants to appeal that decision. And then in terms of the international protection procedure, so we had 3 kind of very interesting cases there. The first, T, Russian Federation, concerned a Russian national who was a Muslim man from the Caucasus region and had been accused of terrorism in Russia. He sought international protection in Ireland, and that case was appealed. It was a decision from the tribunal, appealed to the High Court, and really the decision was quashed, but it was really about kind of the assessment of criminality in that case. MH concerned a Pakistani national who sought international protection in Ireland, and the assessment of documentation in that case in the context where there are credibility concerns for that individual. And then TF is a case of a Romanian national who was granted refugee status in Ireland probably in about the early 2000s, and was then subsequently issued with a European arrest warrant. And so how do you assess criminality in the context of a revocation of status? And then the last one on this slide is a temporary protection case. It doesn't concern the directive itself, but more concerns kind of child abduction and child protection. And it's a very interesting case in that it was a child who was brought to Ireland by her mother. and had lived with her father in Ukraine. The father did not consent to the child being taken out of Ukraine. The child was unhappy and unsettled in Ireland, and this case was brought to the High Court. And there, the judge really has to kind of assess the best interest of the child and whether the child should remain in Ireland or be returned to her father in a context of war in Ukraine. And it was ultimately decided that it was in the best interest of the child to return her to Ukraine. And then on the next slide, so another key case from 2023 was Middlecamp. So that concerned a Canadian woman in Ireland on a working holiday visa and the extension of that permission, whether or not that could be extended. And it looks at kind of Article 8, European Convention of Human Rights, and whether that can apply in those cases. It didn't in this to permit an extension of a visa. And then we have a citizenship case. Again, I'll talk about this in a bit more detail in a minute. So A, B, and C versus the Minister for Foreign Affairs, and concerns kind of the right to citizenship by birth for a child born via surrogate. And then we have one on deportation. So ODIM, number 2. So this concerns deportation and essentially the rights of non-citizens in Ireland under the Constitution. And then the last one is racism, Anya Makehia, which concerned a prison officer in Ireland who was subject to racial abuse and racial harassment from prisoners, and how his employers, the prison service, dealt with that and implemented measures to prevent racial harassment. So the first case I'm going to go into depth on is SY versus the Minister for Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. And this was one of the first kind of big cases on homeless international protection applicants in Ireland. And this case concerned a 17-year-old Afghan national who was assessed as an adult at the time of application. And he was informed when he applied that there was no accommodation available. He was given a €28 voucher for Dunnes Stores in the address of a charity, the Capuchin Day Centre. And then he slept rough for 3 weeks in parks and train stations in Dublin, and he did not have access to basic hygiene facilities during that time. So it was a case that was brought by the applicant with the help of the Irish Refugee Council. And in the High Court, Judge Meenan recognises that there was a shortage of accommodation. This is not contested in the case by the minister. But also highlights how there were other material reception conditions that should have been provided to the applicant under the Reception Conditions Directive and Ireland's transposition of that directive. So it's not only accommodation, it also concerns kind of food and access to basic hygiene facilities. And Judge Meenan found the applicant was deprived of the most basic standard of living, and the alternative steps that should have been in place were not in place, and the voucher and the direction to charities was insufficient. So in this case, the declarations were granted, including a breach of Article 1 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU, which is really quite significant. And that Article 1 concerns human dignity. So a breach of that applicant's human dignity. And the next case, so this is A, B, and C versus the Minister for Foreign Affairs. This was a Supreme Court case in May, and it concerns A and B, who are a same-sex couple in the UK. A was an Irish national, B was a British national. They were married, and they decided to have a child. The child was born via a surrogate. B was the biological father of the child. At the time of birth, the mother, the surrogate, was registered as the child's mother. A and B then subsequently obtained a parental order through the English courts to recognise them as parents. And the question that arose in this case was the child entitled to Irish citizenship at birth? So they had applied for an Irish passport for the child. This was refused by the Department of Foreign Affairs. They appealed that then to the High Court. The High Court said that the child was entitled to Irish citizenship at birth and overturned that decision. And then an appeal was brought to the Supreme Court by the minister. And in the reasoning and the decision that was made in that case in the Supreme Court, they looked at Section 7.1 of the Irish Nationality and Citizenship Act. And under that section, a person is an Irish citizen if at the time of their birth, either parent was an Irish citizen. So if you recall, B was a British national, A was an Irish national, but was not on the registered, the birth certificate when the child was born. And so the Supreme Court held that the interpretation of parent in Irish law really depends on the language, the context, and the objective in that legislation. In this case, in section 7.1, parent really refers only to the genetic father of the child and the birth mother, and you can't alter that legislative scheme from which the provision was enacted. So in this case, A was considered not to be the child's parent for the purpose of section 7.1. There are other means through which the child can get a passport, but for section 7.1, it was held not to be permitted. And then the last case, that's Odom. So Odom, many of you may be familiar with this case. It first came up to the Supreme Court at the start of 2023, and that concerned the question of mootness. So Mr. Odom had been granted a residence permit under the 2022 regularisation scheme, but it was considered that this was an important case of public interest, so it continued on. So in November, the Supreme Court heard this case, and it was Mr. Odom who arrived to Ireland irregularly in 2007. Not long after, he married a Nigerian national who was also in Ireland, but their marriage was not registered and it was not considered lawful. They had 3 children together and then subsequently separated in 2014. All this time, Mr. Odom did not hold a residence permission. He then, after their separation, applied for residency, but was issued with a deportation order. And in that decision, as some of you may be aware, the minister has to kind of weigh the different reasons as to why a deportation order should be issued or why it should not be issued. And the minister considered various rights, including the rights to family life under Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights, and ultimately decided to issue a deportation order. A judicial review was brought on that to the High Court, who upheld the minister's decision, and then this was appealed to the Supreme Court. So just very quickly, I'm conscious of time, but in the Supreme Court, they distinguished this case from many other deportation cases in that the couple were not married, they were not cohabiting, and also that the children were non-EU citizens, so very different rights at play here. And they really look into kind of what rights do non-citizens have under the Constitution in Ireland. And so Chief Justice O'Donnell writes the main judgment on this, and there are a number of circumstances he recognises in which a non-citizen who has a sufficient connection to the state can be considered the same as a citizen under Article 40.1. And that's kind of the guarantee of equality as human persons before the law. And it was held in this case, in the case of the children who were lawfully resident but were not citizens, that they did have constitutional rights, including to the care, company and companionship of a parent. And this should have been weighed in the deportation decision. However, in the evidence submitted on Mr. Odom's relationship with the children, it was found to be kind of limited and fragmentary, and thus wouldn't have weighed in his favour. So what they decide in this case is that where a parent is in a precarious situation in the state, you really need very exceptional circumstances to invalidate that deportation order, but that non-citizens do have some rights under the Constitution in Ireland. So those are the 3 main cases that we've looked at here, but there's a lot more in the report and also on the website if anyone wants more, and we'll try and keep that up to date as we go.
Thank you very much, Emily and Ciara, for yet more really, really rich information. So I'm going to try and get to some of the questions that we didn't get to before in the limited time left. So we have a question on why beneficiaries of temporary protection are not included in the data set, and maybe Ciara, you can give us some context to that as well, just to remind people of where that was presented.
Yep, absolutely. So we presented this in the residence permits data. So when we were talking about the different reasons for residence permits, so of course, you know, temporary protection is a big omission from that. So, and we did confirm that with the Department of Justice that they don't report, and it's basically for comparability. The temporary protection is reported extensively to Eurostat and other places, and there's a lot of statistics on it. So I think the idea is also just so that over time, it's clear so that we can kind of track residence permits over time, is my understanding.
Thanks, Ciara. And then in relation to processing times in IPAS, are there ranges for processing times, is the question.
Yeah, so I think they also wanted to know if they're in the report, and they are in the report. So basically what we do is we just ask the IPO, and I think we get it from the IPAT annual report, what the processing times are. And my understanding is that they increased for IPAT in the year. I actually should have them here to hand. I should have gotten them to hand already. But they're in the report if you want to check, and we can't really do kind of moving averages, but what we do is just give the median for the year.
Thanks, Ciara. And just confirm that, yes, we will be sending a copy of the slides from today. Another question has come in on, do we know any reasons behind the higher level of being at risk of poverty and social inclusion among the non-EU group?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and I think there's a lot of literature on that. So I think some of the wages hints at it. So we see that in spite of higher kind of labor market activity rates, employment rates, and education, that the income is actually lower for non-EU nationals in particular. And we also see that housing is a really big part of it too. So when you look at the monitoring report on integration, it really goes into depth in housing outcomes. So non-EU nationals are much less likely to own their own home. They're much more likely to live in unaffordable housing. So that means kind of spending a really high proportion of their income on rent. So I think there's a lot of different factors at play, and then the question is, why incomes are lower in spite of, for example, education being higher, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot that you could, I think, unpack there.